I did not expect to get another 1,000 subs so quickly, but at least I already had something planned. I have seen a few comments here and there asking if I can compare the different versions of The Six Wives in book form, since I'm already doing it in visual form. But there is a problem that comes with that, because there are literally hundreds of these books, because it only takes one person to write them, as opposed to a movie, a play, a musical, or a TV series, or even a video game. Yes, in the future we are going to include video games. And I'm a very slow reader, especially when it comes to something that's over 500 pages long. And if I did that, and I included as many as I possibly could, you would be guaranteed to have someone showing up and saying that I missed out this incredibly obscure novel that is out of print and the only copies are worth £300. So it just seems like more hassle than it's worth, and I'm very sorry, but that's not going to happen. Perhaps another YouTuber would like to take on that venture, but I don't mind doing individual book reviews for every 1,000 subscribers that I get outside of significant milestones, and that means we are now covered for 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 and 7,000. Thanks to Alison Weir's 6 Tudor Queen series, which concluded earlier this year. I haven't started on Catherine Parr yet because there was this wonderful trilogy I had to finish. So let's take a look at the second instalment, Anne Boleyn, A King's Obsession. Apparently the series has different titles affixed to the wives in different countries. In the UK, it is a bit sus that Anne Boleyn is the only one that doesn't have Queen attached to her title. I don't know, maybe I'm just a little defensive. After all, I am the reincarnation of Anne Boleyn until proven otherwise.
Class clown is Joe, or is?
There are spoilers ahead, so don't watch this video if you don't want the ending ruined for you. Yes, I know you're about to write in the comments that there is only one way that this can end, but it's the delivery that will make you not want to sleep. Anne's story opens when she is 11 years old and learns that she is going to be sent abroad to Margaret of Austria's court. In this novel, Anne's other 2 brothers, who likely died in infancy, Thomas and Henry, are made into characters who look as if they are about to have illustrious careers, but they die of the sweating sickness while Anne is still in the Netherlands and France. With her brothers overshadowing her and being constantly ridiculed by her older sister Mary for her extra fingernail, Anne and her younger brother George are closely bonded as the runts of the litter. From this first chapter alone, you wouldn't think that Anne would go on to be the confident and assertive woman we know her to have been. Anne finds her confidence as she grows up while away. I think my favourite part of the novel was while she was in the Netherlands and France, mainly because I know how this story ends, and much like when the Titanic is in dock, a part of you just does not want her to leave. You know, she's happy here. Don't let her go back to England. Let her stay and live her best life in France. You notice in her on-screen portrayals that when Henry and Anne meet for the first time, it's made the inciting incident with all the close-ups and the cuts and that. But in this novel, it's far more downplayed and presents it as a moment that the characters don't realise is significant. But because of dramatic irony, we, the readers, know how things are going to go from there. Henry pops up at the Netherlands court with his bro Charles Brandon, who is meant to be courting Margaret. Henry dances with Anne, who has barely hit puberty at the time, and that is the extent of their first meeting. Henry is much more interested in another lady, who insists that she loves Henry and goes into denial about him when he abandons her. Of course, this instantly reminded me of the beginning of Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, where, not in the first chapter, but quite early on, there is a May Day dance, and Angel Clare briefly visits. He notices Tess, the main character, but he doesn't interact with her. And it is made into this thing where, if they had interacted properly, do you think things could have been different? When Anne gets to France, King Louis XII has already died, and her mistress Mary Tudor the Elder is isolated from the court, as the French wait to see if she is carrying a future heir. After being reunited with her sister, Anne is much more confident and is disgusted to witness King Francis attempting to court Princess Mary. Francis is a predatory character in this novel, and the affair between him and Mary Boleyn is portrayed as not as consensual as we thought it to be. This threw me through a loop, but it made sense after hearing so many stories of powerful men isolating a vulnerable girl from help and having his way with her, especially since Mary Boleyn is supposed to be about 17 at this time. Anne blames herself for not being there for her sister, and the newly kindled bond between them felt far more meaningful than the hundreds of pages of The Other Boleyn Girl, because in that version Anne was made into a two-dimensional antagonist. So Mary goes with the princess back to England, and Anne stays behind. There she learns how to avoid the king's advances and those of other men who would want to take advantage of her, skills she will need when she goes back to England. Nonetheless, the sisters are never fully conciliated, and there is a streak of rivalry between them until Anne dismisses Mary from court in 1534, believing that her coming into public with her pregnant belly was a deliberate jab owing to Anne's inability to have a son. I think my favourite moment is towards the end of Anne's stay in France when the court goes to Provence and Anne meets none other than Leonardo da Vinci. Take that, Dan Brown! She's interested to hear his speculations on flying machines and actually sits for one of his portraits. I considered it might have been this portrait here. It is so fanfiction-y, but I love it. After she comes back from England, we all know how the story goes. And I won't get into the full details because I don't want to spoil the entire novel. But the start of her relationship with Henry is shown in the newer and more realistic lens of Anne rebuffing Henry's advances, because what he's doing is incredibly predatory, and she has her sister as living proof of Henry's coldness. All I can say is that because I was listening to this on audiobook for the first time around, I made the mistake of finishing it last thing at night before I went to bed. And we all know how and where the story ends, don't we? Well, every time we saw Anne Boleyn die on screen, the camera always cut away before the impact, and either cuts to the crowd's reaction or something else, promoting the comforting belief that she did not suffer and probably didn't feel anything. This was the narrative I brought up until now, but no, beheading is painful, whether your head comes off in one chop or several, as the head is still alive when it comes off. The final paragraphs of the novel show this directly from Anne's perspective, and the noble and straightforward death we thought she had was a lie. It shows one final injustice against her. She was guaranteed a painless death, and yet she had to see her headless body writhing until the darkness came. Be assured, I was holding my neck for a good hour afterwards. When I was writing my Anne Boleyn Part 3 script, I had hoped to read the execution scene from the novel as the intro, hence I brought the paperback. But you can't really do that with a published work unless you're reading from a book that is in the public domain. So if I brought Tessa d'Urville off the shelf right now and read the last chapter, I wouldn't get in trouble for reading it, but the thing is, you're only allowed to read so much of one book before you had to pay royalties to the writer's estate. Just to make sure, I contacted Weir through her website, and she replied that I come up with my own thing, and that was how I came up with the idea to read the Thomas Wyatt poem. And that's why I read poems for all the Definitive Moment videos now. I think you'll like the one I chose for Anna von Clever Part 3. I think the only piece of text that has ever disturbed me just as much as that final chapter was quite recently in Lara Croft and the Blade of Guinevere, where Lara Croft crawls headfirst into a cramped passageway, digging her way through, getting covered in cobwebs of spiders that are venomous because she is in Sri Lanka at the time. And she just thinks, keep moving, crawl your way through. Don't get bitten, for goodness sake, you do not need an insect bite right in the middle of a rainforest. And when she gets to the other side, she's survived. But then she finds a massive spider crawling across her hand, and believe me, I shivered and I was just like, oh, I'm not going to sleep yet now. Oh my god. I would consider getting physical copies of all the books in the series, because the audiobooks don't contain the author's note at the end, where Weir discusses how she approached the story, the characterisation, and explains the justifications behind the more fictional aspects of the plot. Weir writes that it was harder than you could imagine trying to write a story about Anne Boleyn that stuck solely to her perspective. not only because there are few, if any, historical sources that were written in her own hand, but also because the accuracy of Anne Boleyn's character is actually more of a subjective viewpoint among historians than we initially think. I believe Anne was given as fair a portrayal as you can get in a novel that covers her entire life, and it doesn't shy away from the flaws that she had. As much as I love Anne, I know full well that she wasn't perfect. I don't expect my heroes to be perfect. If we met in real life, I'm sure our opinions would vastly differ. I mean, despite Cromwell's Machiavellian deeds, I can still appreciate his intelligence. It's just that there is a difference between heroes that lived hundreds of years ago and heroes that are still alive today, because the dead ones already have their story written, but the living ones still don't have the full story. Nevertheless, we see that the crueler part of Anne didn't come out of nowhere. She loses patience with Princess Mary, who keeps rebuffing her. She's unsatisfied with Henry in bed and his constant neglect, hence she attacks his manhood, and her bitter rivalry with her sister caused her to then banish her from court. While I was worried that we were going to have Anne be guilty of at least one of her crimes, and because, I don't know, maybe the shadow of Philippa Gregory just hangs over this book series, I was glad that Anne's innocence stayed intact. The more sympathetic portrayals of Anne Boleyn like to show her as the Juliet in a loveless marriage, and her Romeo is the man she wanted to marry but Henry VIII prevented in some way. In the opera, it was Henry Percy. In the Tudors, it was Thomas Wyatt, and in this, it's Henry Norris. Anne hides affection for him, but by the time he is widowed and she could possibly marry him, she has already promised herself to the king. In one of the final scenes before she is arrested, Norris and Anne find themselves alone together in a place that no one will find them, and there is even a bed in the room, begging them to give in to their passions. But Anne thankfully passes the test and resists, telling Norris that she loves him, but has accepted that they can never be together, and thus she still dies innocent. As for her relationship with Elizabeth, it is rightly shown that Anne rarely saw her, and though this is just my interpretation, I wouldn't wonder if there was some hint of postpartum depression in there too. You'll have to read it to understand. The way I perceived Anne kept changing throughout the story. When I was reading the Catherine of Aragon book, I continually just kept seeing Annette Crosby's interpretation, because to me that is a definitive interpretation of Catherine of Aragon. But in this one, Anne's face kept shifting from Genevieve Bujold to Dorothy Chewton to Natalie Dormer, and I even think Natalie Portman popped in a few times. In the final execution scene, my vision of her kept phasing between Claire Foy, Dormer and Bujold. I think that pretty much establishes just how uneven the ground is when it comes to Anne Boleyn interpretations. In some ways, there will always be a layer of mystery, and the interpretation will always depend on how the author views her. For the most part, I really enjoyed this one. I was ready to have some of my dearer opinions of Anne challenged, but I lost no love for her by the end, and in a way, I've gained a new and haunting perspective. If there is to be an adaptation of these books, I think many would come for Anne Boleyn and stay for the rest of the wives. I'd also like to recommend Ruth Wilson as Anne, or someone similar based solely off her performance in His Dark Materials. Obviously, because this takes place over a long period of time, you'd have to change actresses regularly. This makes a great follow-up to the first instalment of the series, and while I haven't gotten to Catherine Parr yet, I am looking forward to seeing how events play out for her. Despite the controversial nature of the fourth book, I enjoyed it. I would class Jane Seymour's outing as essential reading if you're hoping to complete the whole series, although Anne's portrayal is vastly different in that one. She has a complete 180 from the version we see here. Then again, that is through Jane's biased perception. But if you're looking for a nice long listen or read, I would recommend A King's Obsession. And it is kind of unavoidable to compare this with The Other Boleyn Girl and appreciate how much more humanised the former version is. When I get to 9,000 subscribers, I would like to do a redux of Anne Boleyn's ranking list, and I'll go into more detail there as to how the Other Boleyn Girl version of Anne was Flanderised to the point of just being a bitch. I wanted to do this in front of the camera, but there's been a huge clash in schedules over the weekend, and rather than overwork myself, I think it's just easier to do it this way. So, on Tuesday the 7th of September this year, I finally got round to watching Six the Musical, and you have no idea how much it meant to me. You know, I love musicals. I've always loved musicals. I suppose it's because one of the first movies I ever remember watching was Labyrinth. So I initially discovered the musical out of my peripheral vision in summer of 2019 because I was doing a lot of volunteer work in the centre of town at the time. And to get there, I'd have to pass by Nottingham's Theatre Royal and Concert Hall, where they had posters for upcoming shows. And Six was one of them, but I never really looked at it until Diva of Musical Hell fame did a summary of the musical on YouTube not long after, and that was when I started to get interested. I listened to all the songs in one day, and I was thinking about going to the West End for my next birthday to watch the show. But then, come September 2019, and I remembered that it was actually going to be on at the Theatre Royal, so I would save a lot of money by just going into town as opposed to going all the way down to London. And it would be on in March 2020. So it occurred to me that if I didn't buy a ticket soon, then by the time the musical came around, either I wouldn't have any money to buy a ticket or it would be sold out. So I got my ticket then and there, and I was prepared to wait 6 months for when I could finally see it. I had booked the most perfect seat for someone on a budget, because the dress circle in the Theatre Royal is really expensive because it's the best seats in the house. So I got one on the upper circle instead, but it was still like on the front row, not exactly in the middle, but in the middle section. But then the you-know-what happened, and as it was on the rise during the start of 2020, I don't think any of us could have imagined how out of control it got. Nonetheless, I kept hoping and hoping that I would still be able to watch Six, because by the beginning of March, it didn't seem that the UK was going to go into lockdown because the government were trying to peddle their herd immunity at us. And I just thought, just let me see this one show, then you can do whatever you want and I won't care. Then literally a week before I was supposed to go to the show, that was when the pubs, the theatres, the bars, the cafes, they all closed down. I'm looking at my diary entry right now, and the news literally tore through me. And I quote, "I lost all motivation today when I realised how pointless life really is. How on earth was the virus allowed to spread so far? What utter incompetence led to depleted supermarkets and resources drying up like this?" So I was miserable for a full week, and on the day I was meant to go and see it, I was just so angry that I signed up for Disney Plus so I could shut out the world, and then took out all my anger in my back garden by tearing up this large amount of ivy that we've got growing over everything in the garden. And at least I made a Robin's Day when I upturned all this earth and gave him a buffet of fresh worms. A couple months later I got an email and it said that rather than refund my ticket to Six, they were moving it back to October of 2020. And I thought, okay, maybe it all will have been solved by then. Maybe I'll actually get to watch it. But then a few months after that, it was again pushed back to September 2021. But I kind of saw it coming, And all this time we've been waiting for September 2021 to roll by. I didn't dare hope that I would actually get to watch it. I kept thinking it's just going to get pushed back another year and I'm never going to see it. Unless, I actually fork out to go down to the West End. But theatres have been coming back gradually over the summer. I made it to the Theatre Royal on Tuesday night, and I was taking every precaution. Rather than risk missing a bus, I took an Uber in, and while I was crossing the road I was like, do not move until the green man, do not move until the green man, because I just had a premonition of getting hit by a bus as I crossed the road. But once I was inside, I finally felt safe. By God, the show was absolutely amazing, even though it was hot as hell in the auditorium. You don't even notice that the musical is so short. I'm sure everyone has had that experience of waiting so long to watch something that you're really, really, really looking forward to, only to finally see it and it's just awful. Everyone has had that experience. But I was so happy that this was not the case for me. It was probably because I was setting myself up for the disappointment of the show being delayed or cancelled at the last minute, and my relief, coupled with my enjoyment of the show, made the experience all the more epic. Call me smug, but after the final song, I literally led the standing ovation. Plus, I've been starved of theatre for so long, and it was just so wonderful to be able to sit and enjoy a show. I mean, I had gone to see Heathers the musical just a few days beforehand, but I think I just need to watch a lot of plays and musicals and operas in the theatre just to catch up on all this lost time, After I got up, I turned around and there was this old guy sitting behind me, and he did not look like the target audience for the musical. I think he must have been dragged there by his wife. And he just looked so outraged at this musical. Like, it's just like, oh God, I just sat through the worst thing I will ever see. Rah, 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 rah. And I think I might have contributed to it because I could not stop dancing in my seat. Oh dear. I mean, how dare I show up to a theatre all clad in a lovely green dress with my B necklace and my A necklace and my hair with the Sailor Moon buns and my red lipstick and all that, dance in my seat while I enjoyed this show I waited 2 years to watch. Oh dear. Well, in the words of my beloved Anne, sorry not sorry. Let who will complain. Like with most musicals that go on tour, they were selling merchandise in the lobby, and I think I want to make it a point that every time I go and see a musical, I want to get a piece of merch just to remember the experience. The last 2 times I've done that, I managed to hold back and not overspend, but for 6, I had been waiting 2 years, of course, so I thought I deserved to treat myself, and I got a keyring, a programme, and this t-shirt. It cost me the best of 40 quid. And this insane splurging was made possible by my wonderful patrons. If you want to help support the channel, you can become a patron as well. The link is in the description, and it will be very useful in helping me get these videos out to you without having to worry about monetary troubles. And there are pretty good rewards as well, like having your name in the credits, getting early access to videos and to scripts of videos, and you will get a shout out, just like my 2 VIP patrons, Anastasia Gracia and Alison Cuff. And to my patrons who signed up before the end of August but didn't get their name in the credit before they were charged, I'm going to give you a lot of special shout out as well. Erin Hart, Farah Khan and Jess and Anna Pedroso and Ray Chell. Thank you guys so much for joining up. You all make an amazing contribution. You're all amazing. And if you like the video and you want to see more, make sure you like and subscribe, and please make sure you hit that bell in next to it as well, because then you'll actually be notified of when a new video comes out. Next up, we're going to Anna of Cleves once more. So it looks like Catherine Howard will be coming out in October. We're just going to keep on keeping on, okay? We'll see you next time. Bye.